Hi, everyone. I'm Eilina Armstrong, and I am the president of the Cloud Security Alliance. We are happy you could join us for our Cloud Trust Summit. It's an annual event that we hold. And to help kick off this event, we're starting off with a fireside chat with Pete Cronus, who is a longtime contributor to and supporter of CSA. He's held many CISO roles over the years and currently is the EVP and Chief Information Security Officer with Paramount Global. And we're going to really talk about this idea of maintaining a strong cloud assurance and operational resilience posture. So, Pete, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
Linda, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to chat with you as well.
Excellent. So I guess we'll just jump right in. Before we start with some of the questions, and you and I have been talking quite a bit about this whole idea, but perhaps it would be beneficial for our audience to understand in your current role kind of the scope of your oversight and sort of the complexities of your environment and everything that you have to manage with your team.
Yeah, so you think about Paramount, right? 25, $30 billion company. Parts of the company are 100 years old, like our movie business. We have the number one broadcast network on TV in the US, CBS. But we're a global broadcaster. I've heard us called one of the largest broadcasters on the planet, right? And so we have that traditional TV business. It also includes MTV, Comedy Central, VH1, BET as part of our lineup. And then, look, we're also a global streaming provider and provide digital services through Paramount Plus and Pluto TV, and then CBS News and Sports, and those are all part of our organization. And the information security team at Paramount is responsible for helping to secure all of those ecosystems. We have 50,000 employees. If you look at all of the people that operate in tech across the company, think about it as 50,000 employees total, employees and contractors across the company. That's, depending upon, the season and how many shows we have in production, that's total employees. And then when you look at tech, that could be anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000, right? Depending upon, how you add those numbers up. That includes, our streaming group and some of our digital groups and our corporate IT function. So tech is a really important component of the company. It represents a large percentage of the population. And so it's a pretty complicated business and, pretty complicated operation because we have so many different areas of the entertainment ecosystem represented, inside one company.
So certainly then you're in a perfect position to kind of talk more about some of the lessons learned and some of the things that you and your team may be experiencing and provide some guidance. I mean, when we talk about cloud assurance, it's definitely a journey, not a destination. It's something that, you really need to be persistent and dedicated to kind of achieving and then maintaining that kind of posture. I wonder if you could talk about just some of the key challenges that organizations generally face these days when they're looking at having a very strong, effective, quality kind of cloud security and risk management posture.
Yeah, and I've talked about this quite a bit, kind of over the years. But you start to think about it, I think the CISO's greatest challenge, especially if you're new to the organization or you're walking in the door, even sometimes if you've been in the organization for a long time, it's just understanding kind of the landscape, understanding not just the key systems, but how they're hosted or how they're managed and maintained, different technologies. I think leading a security organization is I think one of the toughest jobs in companies today. I say that, not selfishly, but, because you have to know every area of the business. You have to understand every area of the business. You have to understand, how they use technology. And look, when even small businesses, it's complicated. When you get into large, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, it can definitely be hyper complicated. So kind of knowing what you have, which sounds so basic, is a highly complex job. And, sometimes it can take years to figure it all out. And that's even if you have a chance of success. So, very often, not all technology groups are centralized, or sometimes, that job of kind of knowing what you have, let alone adding governance to it, is hyper complicated because of the company structure. So if you have the opportunity and you can lay out the landscape of your tech ecosystem, and then understand with mathematical precision, how you're operating and how your controls are protecting that ecosystem, then I think that's an incredible achievement, because it's so hard. And so that's, I think, the first step. How much of your ecosystem can you understand? How much of your ecosystem can you evaluate? And then, how well are you doing in terms of developing kind of controls and capabilities that you can use to protect that ecosystem? And again, knowing that with mathematical precision is, really the goal. And if you can achieve it, then I think you've got the makings of a pretty good program.
So certainly then organizational, or I should say cloud security leaders definitely need to account for the complexities internally, especially if we're dealing with a global organization. But even, SMBs have to have a really strong idea of how they're operating, where they're operating, et cetera. But then you throw into the mix all of the threats, the different types of attacks. Some would argue these attacks are getting a little bit more sophisticated. Certainly, they seem a bit more frequent. From your perspective and working with your team, what are some of the more concerning attacks, attack methods, or threats that you're seeing currently?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. Whatever you see at the nation state level today, right, will be commoditized and offered by, these kind of ransomware or malware as a service providers. So it's always good, even if you're not maybe the target of a nation state actor, just to kind of keep an eye on what's happening in the most sophisticated kind of realm of cybersecurity, because eventually that's going to make its way down and become, a threat for everyone. And so I think that's really interesting. I think the challenge that we have with malware and ransomware today is it's commoditized. You don't have to, you can go out and, consume this ransomware as a service or malware as a service as a relatively unsophisticated threat actor and target companies. And you can do that at scale. And so even if federal law enforcement takes down these entities, very often they pop back up in various forms, and so it's a persistent threat, and it doesn't just impact us directly; it also impacts our vendor ecosystem as well. And many of us, and this from your work in CSA as well, Alina, that the big challenge for security professionals is not just protecting your ecosystem, protecting the vendor ecosystem that services your company as well. And it's not uncommon. Some of the most high profile threat actor attacks, ransomware attacks have been against the supply chain, companies that we all rely on, or companies that are relied on pretty heavily within a particular sector, like say healthcare. So it's a pretty complicated set of threats that we have to operate against.
And I definitely want to come back to that, the whole supply chain and working with your partners later in the conversation, because that that conversation has been coming up again and again in many different arenas. We just had a very successful CSA AI summit at the RSA conference. A wonderful lineup of speakers. You were one, of course, and you know, it was just a packed house the whole day, that first Monday of RSA conference. Obviously, we're having multiple meetings with our different constituents who are supporting our AI safety initiative and helping to release research and education and all these things that we have associated with that particular effort. It's certainly top of mind for all of our members. I'm just wondering, when it comes to kind of getting a handle on the threat landscape and determining, you know, ways forward, how is generative AI, LLMs, and even future multimodal AI complicating the threat landscape for you and your peers? And then on the flip side, which is something, you know, that's something we're studying and we're looking to release guidance on. But then on the flip side, we're also looking to provide guidance on how folks like you, Pete, and your teams can actually leverage AI currently and to sort of address these challenges, to address these threats, and then how you will be able to evolve the usage of AI, leveraging AI going forward. So it's kind of a two-tiered question. So how is it making it harder for you all?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, but before I dive in, just wanted to say thanks, Elena, to you and the rest of the folks at Cloud Security Alliance for, you know, for leading on AI security, because I think it's a big challenge today. There's a lot of, you know, kind of FUD out there and a lot of hype, not just around AI tech, but AI threats. And, you know, look, anybody says they're an AI expert, right? I always get suspicious, because this is kind of a generative AI specifically is new and emerging. And it's nice to have somebody like Cloud Security Alliance who's been in the game for a long time, has a trusted name and trusted brand, kind of help pull the community together and, you know, kind of help guide us and provide, you know, real world, whether it's white papers or guidance on, you know, on how to take all that hype and turn it into, you know, kind of a risk management strategy. So, so many thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So you start to think, I think about the AI threat kind of in two dimensions, or the AI risk, maybe we'll say.
Yeah.
First is you know, what's the threat landscape? You know, those ransomware as a service, those malware as a service, those nation states. How are they going to leverage AI to attack us? So that's one dimension. And I think the second dimension is, you know, how is using AI inside of our companies, you know, impact the risk dynamic. And so maybe I'll answer it two ways. And so here's my perspective today. So we know when we look at the vulnerability ecosystem today and we look at the research, we're on track to have about 30,000 new vulnerabilities registered in the National Vulnerability Database this year. So 30,000 known vulnerabilities across the ecosystem. We also know from research that only about 4% of those vulnerabilities are typically ever used by threat actors for exploit. And we expect that as ransomware as a service vendors incorporate some of the AI kind of technology and capabilities in their platforms, we expect that they'll be able to develop more proof of concepts and more attacks for more different types of vulnerabilities across the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. So we're at 4% today. The research says maybe that number grows, you know, substantially. So now you have to start thinking about how to protect your ecosystem against broader threats. And then I think the other thing when I talk to experts, they say is, look, what AI may be able to do, AI attacks may look like, as they may look more targeted, and then you might see more targeted vectors that happen kind of all at once. Mm-hmm. And so it's not uncommon to see threat actors today kind of get a foothold on your network, leveraging maybe one or two particular vulnerabilities or issues, and then kind of work their way deeper. Imagine if that's all automated, and instead of one or two vectors, Now there's 50 or 60 vectors all at once. How do you plug the holes, right?
Yeah.
And when you go from an attack landscape where you have say minutes, hours, sometimes even days, kind of plug one or two of these holes. What happens when you have seconds and minutes? I don't think, operationally, the capabilities and technology exists. And I don't think, when you think of people, process, and technology, I don't think the way we're organized today in our incident response programs and capabilities across the ecosystem, not talking about my company, but just like in general across the ecosystem, are prepared for that. And maybe that's the worst case scenario. Maybe it evolves to that at some point. But I think more threats, more targeted attacks, and a harder challenge defending kind of the ecosystem against those targeted attacks is what I would expect. So it's a good time to retire, I think. No, I'm kidding. I think on the other side, look, we have this interesting challenge. You have this incredible opportunity for companies to potentially leverage generative AI kind of capabilities and tools and drive, increases in productivity and potentially increases in profitability. So companies are going to be, I think, aggressively chasing after those opportunities. I think in some companies, they're starting slow, trying to figure out what it looks like. I think some companies are embracing it. Companies of our size, you start to take a look at it and say, look, if I can get efficiency gains of 5-10%, and I'm just making that up, with an appropriate kind of investment, and that's realized, that's a huge benefit to our shareholders. So I think you're going to see, if you haven't seen it already, many of us are going to see this top-down push from executives and boards of directors to explore and try to evaluate whether or not this is all hype, or if there's some kind of benefit. So I think there's a lot of companies out there today that are already kind of knee deep in trying to figure out what this means. And of course, that's going to evolve, right? We're on the cusp. And I'm not thinking necessarily, Chat GPT is going to change the world or, those types of technologies. But what the LLMs mean to each of our different businesses and uses. How do we, do finance teams model cash flow? How do entertainment companies like ours, try to make their operations more efficient? Is there a way to do that, without causing, severe disruption to our business or to our, business partners or to our talent? Are there ways to do that in a meaningful way? And so I think what you're seeing, I think the biggest risks and threats that what we're talking about here is what happens when you send proprietary data or sensitive data into the model, and how does that enrich your results, and then how does that potentially lead to data leakage, and potentially take sensitive, private, non-public information and then unintentionally expose it. So I think that's the biggest risk. I'm not worried about it as much on a user by user basis, but as you start to plug in AI tools into your business processes, as you start to build your own kind of AI apps, leveraging engineering tools or leveraging AI models directly, or as you start to develop your own LLMs, I think most people are going to most people are going to buy rather than build. Yeah. How do you have the right processes, principles, and practices, the right governance in place to make sure that you're using tools that you can secure or configure securely, so you can reduce that risk of kind of data leakage. You can protect that sensitive information. You can protect your intellectual property. You can protect your business relationships. In a way, with certainty, I should say. And so that's how I think about it.
And it's funny you mentioned that too, because I think that's a big call as we're kind of digging into our different research groups that are supporting this AI safety initiative and some of the releases that will be coming out over the summer months and even throughout the rest of the year, including an update to our cloud controls matrix, is this idea of transparency. You know, a lot of CISOs, just like you, want to really understand um, as they are working with the large LLM frontier models and providers, what can they know rather than be told that it's happening? So this notion of transparency, I think, is going to be a critical point going forward for sure.
I agree. I agree.
Um, so I mentioned our CCM, and I want to get to that for a minute because you've been a big champion of that over the years. But the other area that I think we'd be remiss in not covering would be this whole notion of this whole idea of considering privacy and compliance controls. And, you know, we're seeing all of these updates to myriad mandates across the globe. Here in the US, you've got the Security and Exchange Commission updates to a breach notification, et cetera. Some concerns there. Certainly, CSA made comments on what they were doing last year with help from our members. Stuff coming out of different states, just all over the globe, really. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about as part of that cloud assurance and operational resilience path. How can you and your peers and teams kind of ensure that you're taking into account the compliance with all these mandates without duplicating effort? That always seems to be a big concern.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think it's a challenge whose answer is kind of evolving, right? Because a lot of this legislation is evolving and is new, and you know, in some cases, some of the regulations are still in the rulemaking process. But here's what I'll say: look, you're going to need kind of oversight, and a lot of the things that we've done in cloud security apply very nicely in the world of AI security. And that's true from, I shouldn't just say security, but security and privacy. So a lot of the concepts and principles. And so you have to know kind of what data you're collecting, how it's being used, and you have to be transparent about that with your consumers. And so you're seeing a lot of those practices and principles being adopted kind of in the AI ecosystem as well. How is AI being used? How is your data being used? Who has access to that data that's being gathered about you? Those are all really important. In some areas of the world, you know, knowing that information is considered a human right. That's your data. It's about you. And so I think, you know, I see a lot of companies taking that very seriously and, you know, trying to understand and balance these regulations with kind of the needs of the business. How do we support our consumers? How do we well, I was going to say accommodate, but how do we make sure that we live up to the commitments we make to our consumers, and also live up to the commitments we make to our shareholders, right? About, maximizing the performance of the business. So it's a pretty interesting balance. And as rules and regulations come out, as rules are interpreted, laws are interpreted by the courts, these things are adjusting kind of all the time. Yeah, I used to think the cybersecurity landscape was complicated, but boy, the privacy landscape and understanding of the privacy landscape is, I would say, 10 times, sometimes maybe even 100 times more complicated than the cybersecurity world. That's where the focus and the emphasis on. That's the frontier on protecting consumers, is in that privacy space and that ecosystem. I think staying in tune with it is critical.
And so when you take all of these things for which you and your teams are responsible, how do you, and I was talking to a CISO friend of mine at RSA just a couple of weeks ago, and we were discussing this whole notion of having like standards and simplifying the process. And she referred to being a big fan of CSA's cloud controls matrix, which is 17 domains, 197 security controls, cloud specific security controls, and then the related consensus assessment initiative questionnaire, which really helps to kind of level the playing field. You have this one standard questionnaire, it's related to CCM, and it really helps ensure that her and her team are partnering with the right providers. They're making sure that internally they're adhering to certain controls. And they're also, speaking of the supply chain earlier, that they're kind of making sure that their partners are aware of the CCM and the cake that we call it. And I just wonder, from your perspective and this long relationship that you've had with CSA, we're celebrating our 15th anniversary this year. How do you see the CCM, or how does the CCM and the cake kind of help sort of bring all these things together and hopefully at least not maybe simplify the process a little bit or strengthen it, I guess?
Yeah, look, I would say if I had to say like 15 years ago, and maybe it was 14 years ago when this came out, but one of the biggest contributions that CSA made was creating this cloud controls kind of matrix and then mapping it to all the different industry standards and frameworks. So if you're in the financial services industry, or you're in healthcare, it's all mapped. And then kind of updating that and keeping that up to date is no kind of small task. And so I think that was a huge contribution that CSA made and continues to make. And then so you start to think about, okay, now I know what good looks like in the cloud. And then, by the way, this also can apply inside my ecosystem and outside my ecosystem, in my vendor ecosystem, in my supply chain. So I'm really lucky. I'm part of an industry where Cloud Security Alliance has partnered very closely with the Motion Picture Association and have created kind of this common set of kind of capabilities. So the MPA uses cloud security standards, and then they use that to create a central registry of vendor security assessments, right? So member security assessments are part of MPA's program. It's kind of like STAR for the TV and movie industry, right? CSA STAR program. They can do one assessment, register it, and then that could be used across multiple different. So vendors don't have to fill out these questionnaires multiple times. They fill it out once like they do in STAR, and then they can share these and then can be audited on them as well. So we're really lucky that that the entertainment industry has partnered with CSA. So we have kind of continuity in the ecosystem. And if you look at what MPA has done and what the STAR registry has done, you have thousands of vendors that are essentially attesting to a set of controls that we all agree are the standards for what good looks like in the cloud. And, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have that, right? And so I think if more industries, adopt a relationship with CSA, I think the better off the ecosystem, I think would be. And the technology, I use the word ecosystem a lot because it's a big word and I know what it means. And I don't know a lot of big words, but ecosystem really kind of nails it, right? This is a highly complex set of interdependent elements. And so, and some of these technology elements, especially some of these cloud technology elements, these SaaS providers are across the globe. You think about AWS and GCP and Azure and Oracle and, ServiceNow. And these are companies that are in every ecosystem, right? And they're critical to the survival of our economies, right? And so anyway, it's pretty complicated. If we had to sit down and figure out what AWS's security posture is, that would be really difficult if every company had to do that. But because they are transparent about their security controls and how they operate, and they're transparent about what good looks like for them, and we have this kind of minimum standard that CSA has helped develop, we can evaluate them and evaluate other providers in the ecosystem very similar. So it makes the job a little bit easier. It's still tough, right? Because many of our most critical vendors in our ecosystems, especially industry specific vendors aren't large multi-billion dollar companies. They're, sometimes a few $1,000,000 or less in terms of revenue. And so what CSA has done is set a standard of what good looks like, and then created, a stepped approach, right, to cloud security that smaller companies and larger companies can both use. And so I think that's very beneficial, and probably ways that we could probably spend hours exploring, and it's really a big deal.
Yeah, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, we have our Security Trust Assurance and Risk Registry, which really is like the largest global repository of assurance statements from different types of cloud providers and even other organizations that really want to just publicize and attest to the different security controls that they have been able to put in place. And so whenever organizations are looking for a provider, they can go to that registry. And it's all, all of this is, as most know, CSA is a vendor neutral nonprofit, and we have thousands of volunteers who give us their mind share to ensure that we're covering all the bases. So it really is it's just one of the primary, one of the resources I hear most often discussed among CISOs. And we're unfortunately coming a bit close to the end, but I did wonder, I wanted to give some final words to you, Pete, and ask you, have there been any lessons learned over the years that you think are have been beneficial to you and your team, and you'd like to share one or two with the audience, or perhaps just some parting words of advice, key things they should keep in mind, like a top 3?
Yeah, look, I think, coming from an entrepreneurial background was really helpful to me as I grew up in security, right? I didn't start in security. I had a very, I had a background well beyond outside of tech. And I think that gave me an advantage coming into tech, and then even coming into security, and because it helped me understand and appreciate the business, and it also helped me get comfortable being uncomfortable, not knowing the answers to questions, but being curious enough and confident enough to go after the answers. And so I would encourage CISOs to, kind of put their business hats on more than they maybe put their tech hat on, because I think that's more important if you're an information security leader. Sometimes I would encourage them to, I think, be curious. I think intellectually curious about how their business operates and what motivates their business stakeholders. And look, I think it's a job where you also have to be a little bit fearless. And I think there are times where it's really tough because you have to sometimes deliver. You have to deliver the truth, and sometimes it's the truth. The truth that maybe people don't want to hear, but you have to be the bearer of bad news, because you've got to deliver that bad news in order for there to be momentum and action. And so I think it's a really, I think it's a tough job for a variety of reasons, but I encourage people, put your business hat on. Most of the successful CISOs that I learned from were really good business leaders who understood kind of technology. And I think that's a kind of really helpful. It's been helpful to me. It's been helpful to many that I look up to kind of along the way. So hopefully that's helpful advice.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. It's always a pleasure speaking with you and learning from you. If you all have any questions for Pete, just drop me a line. You can obviously connect with Pete or me on LinkedIn. And then if you have some direct questions, I encourage you to email me at iarmstrong@cloudsecurityalliance.org, and I can make the appropriate connection for you with Pete. And just a quick heads up, in tandem or shortly as we put all of the content from this Trust Summit on demand for you to check out later, we'll get a follow-up blog from Pete with some additional insight and advice as well that we'll be posting on our website. So look for that too. So thank you again, Pete. And thanks to everyone of you for clicking in. We hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.
Thanks, Elena.